Hi, welcome to Promo Insiders, an ASI Media podcast covering the topics that matter most to the promotional products industry. I'm executive editor Sarah Lavandusky, and today I'm joined by Martha Munroe, a wellness expert and coach based in Canada, who's here to discuss self-care almost a year into the pandemic. How can we reset and realign to continue taking care of ourselves and our families as we weather this situation? That's our topic today. So thank you, Martha, for being with us.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Sarah.
Of course. And everybody who's listening, make sure to comment or ask Martha a question during the session. And you may be one of three winners of a box of Kind bars, courtesy of our friends at Chocolate Inn Lanco. So, as we mentioned, it's now almost a year since the first shutdowns were announced, which is hard to believe. And people were sent home to work and learn. And we had all hoped, only last like 2 weeks, which obviously that didn't happen. So, we were definitely caught off guard by that. And I think if we talk a bit about where we are collectively and how traumatizing this has been for us from a psychological standpoint, like why are things different now as opposed to the start of the pandemic? How is the stress different? And what is that long-term stress doing to us? And I think too, we should talk about, the fact that we're grieving things. We're grieving, people dying, of course, people who've been very sick, but also, our lost plans, deferred dreams. It really is a lost year. So can you speak to that, that long-term stress and how we're dealing with that collectively right now as a collective trauma we're sharing?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's such an important thing to talk about. I saw somebody shared a tweet the other day that was, okay, here we are. We're almost at the 1 year anniversary of, 2 weeks to flatten the curve. And so, so many of us are dealing with something that is so much different than what we expected, a year ago when we were starting to hear all about the novel coronavirus on TV. So I think when we think about stress and the way we think about coping and resilience, the coping strategies and the self-care strategies that we use for more short-term acute stress may not necessarily be as adaptive in the long term. So, if you think back to like the days when you're in university and you're like, okay, I have an exam coming up, it's a week, I'm not going to eat right. I'm not going to get the sleep I really need. I'm not going to get that workout in. I just have to do this thing and then it's over. But that hasn't happened, right? And so some of those avoidance strategies that can actually be adaptive in short-term stress are now, we're seeing that, well, now I've been neglecting all of these ways of taking care of myself for a year. And so I think there's this sort of collective weirdness about the fact that it's been the full year. And like you said, it is grief. And so allowing ourselves, whether we're dealing with real grief of loss of loved ones that people are dealing with, many people are dealing with, or if it's just adapting to a life that is different than what you planned, um, allowing ourselves to have those feelings, really centering self compassion and caring for ourselves, um, I think is the most important thing as we settle into the space of reality right now.
Hmm. Yeah, well said. I think, like you said, naming what those emotions are and not feeling shame about them and
Hmm.
giving yourself the space and the compassion to feel them is like really, I think it's an important, like, big first step for people, Um, yeah, so I think right now, because we're hitting that year milestone, and like you said, it's been kind of like deferred self-care, maybe in a lot of ways for a long time. We really need like a reset because it's not sustainable to live that way. So if we start with, just like getting back to basics, I think we could all use like a reminder of what some of those basic health maintenance of yourself, what does that look like? And if we start with like the beginning of the day when our feet first hit the floor, what are some ways that you would recommend for perhaps getting a better night's sleep? I know that sleep is sometimes very
Hmm.
elusive for a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is actually something I work on with coaching clients all the time. I love focusing on small goals, small actions that we can take. And with almost everybody, it ends up being, okay, well, what needs to happen to make that easier? What needs to happen to make that easier? What needs to happen? And it almost always comes back to sleep. That when we're well rested, It's easier to feed ourselves in a way that feels good. It's easier to have energy to do exercise, to do self-care things, to have patience with our kids, to not feel like we're totally burnt out at work, to manage the many roles that so many of us are doing kind of all at one time. Um, it's a really big one, sleep is. And a lot of them are like fairly common sense things, but it's setting boundaries around things like electronics and watching TV in the evening. And in a very real way, we do need that opportunity to like unplug from life and numb a little bit. It's not necessarily bad to want to tune out and watch Netflix for a bit. I mean, I do that as well. But being mindful of, okay, can I watch something for an hour to give my mind a break and then shut it off and find those boundaries in a way that are going to work. So if you are somebody who struggles with sleep, trying to reduce the caffeine intake gradually can be a really big one, um, because that ends up being a cycle. You sleep poorly, so you have a bit more caffeine, and then the next night is worse, kind of thing. So being aware of that, set yourself a bedtime, right? I think a big part of self-care is almost looking at yourself like you're reparenting yourself and caring for yourself the way that you would want to be cared for by a parent, or the way you'd care for your child or a loved one. So set yourself a bedtime. If you normally go to bed at 1 a.m., setting it for 9 p.m. is probably not going to happen. So think half an hour earlier per week. Set those limits that are going to feel realistic around electronics in the bedroom, watching TV. It's probably not realistic for most of us to never watch TV and never look at our phones in the evening. Um, but maybe we can give ourselves half an hour and slowly work on giving ourselves a little bit more space so that we can sleep better.
Mhm. I actually have a follow-up question for that. Do you also like, I know it's kind of like all business during the week and then party on the weekends where it's just like anything goes, It's like I go to bed whenever, get up whenever, like the kids are running around, who cares? But I think what do you advise for people like even during the weekends? Like, do you recommend having a routine on the weekends too?
I think it depends on what your routine is like and what works for you. So if that's going to throw off your schedule going into the following week, then it's probably not worth it, right? If you stay up until late on Friday night and Saturday night, it might be hard to go to bed at a reasonable hour on Sunday and kind of start your Monday off smoothly, right? So
Mhm.
keeping in mind that next week is going to happen so that it's not kind of all or nothing. I heard
Mhm.
about this concept recently that was something about revenge bedtime procrastination, which is the idea that when we don't have a lot of control over how we're spending our time the rest of the day, we put off our bedtime because we're trying to like maximize what we can do in that time. And I think it's something so many
Mm.
parents can relate to. Like, I have a daughter who's almost 3, and
Mm.
when she goes to bed, that's my only time to, like, feel like an adult, right? Have a
Right.
conversation with my husband, watch some
Right.
TV, maybe make a cup of tea, maybe read a book. Anything that I wanna do for me
Mm.
is going to be in that time, so there's this kind of, like, wanting to take back control,
Mm.
um, but it can end up not serving you, so it's finding the balance of doing those things where you get to have grown-up conversations or, you know, text message with a friend, but without compromising sleep too much.
Mhm. Great, well said. Yeah, I think, sleep is really like the foundation for a lot of these other things because you rely on sleep and good sleep to be like cognitively functioning at a high level where you can make good decisions for yourself. So I think that's a really good way to start the conversation. And when we're talking about, nutrition and hydration, I think beginning, in the first days of the pandemic, it was very like the novelty of like staying in and cooking, kind of nesting and trying, new recipes, healthy recipes, cracking open that cookbook you hadn't cracked open yet. And I think maybe some of that has gone out the window. There's been some fatigue about like always having to cook. And I think people are getting, they want to get back to restaurants and doing that kind of thing. And they're maybe doing takeout that's like, oh, let's just grab a pizza, and how many times do you do that a week, right? So in terms of like nutrition and hydration, making sure that you have like a meal plan, for instance, that you kind of, you plan out, you stick to, you go shopping, you make it beforehand. What are some of your tips for like just having, healthy options around and getting your kids in that too? Because I think sometimes, especially if you're a parent, you end up eating what your kids are eating, right? So how do you
Mhm.
kind of get your kids involved in the healthy choices too?
Yeah, so I mean, I think like you mentioned, planning is a big part of it. Um, and hitting the easy button when you need to, um, and not being so hard on ourselves as well. If it's not going to be super detrimental to your health if you order a pizza once a week. It's not. We don't need to be overly concerned about those small decisions. Um, but most of us probably don't want to be doing that every day, so finding that balance, I think one of the big things is eating enough. I know people are
Hmm.
very sensitive right now. So many people are feeling like they've gained weight during the pandemic, and so there's this sensitivity about eating and eating behaviors, and I think we need to be centering self-compassion again and making sure that we're eating enough. If we find that we're making poor decisions about our eating, it's often helpful to look if there's a restriction first, right? So if you've been subtly kind of trying to eat less during the day, you're going to feel like you're more likely to overdo it at other times. So making sure you're eating
Mm.
enough at your meals, and making the food choices that feel good to you and that notice help you feel more energized. And everybody's going to be a little bit different as to what that's going to be. One of the things that our family has done for the past about 6 or 8 months is we've been ordering the like meal kits because we found that we were ordering takeout more frequently than we wanted,
Mm.
both health wise and also financially, right? It's expensive to be ordering takeout like every day. And so that was a great kind of in between option for our family, with him working full time, me being a full time student, as well as having my business and a toddler. It's a lot. So letting yourself choose an easier option
Hmm.
is can be really helpful. That's been something that's worked really well for our family. And yeah, just planning ahead and centering self compassion is key.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I think the meal kits can really make a difference because it does take time to like hunt down ingredients. You have to buy too much. Like you end up buying more than you need, and sometimes you have to go to multiple places to get everything you need. It takes a lot of time. Yeah, I think the meal
Right.
kits are a great idea.
Yeah, and it's emotional energy too, right? I think that
Mm,
that's like one of the things that the pandemic situation is bringing out is how much in general that type of emotional labor falls on women who are
yeah,
more likely to be working from home at the same time trying to look after kids and maybe
sure.
keep them on the homeschool path, plus the regular household things, plus the person who keeps track of like, do we need more milk, do we need and
Oh yeah.
so if there are ways that are feasible for your family, um to make that a little bit easier, then that can help. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We actually do have a question from a listener. Her name is Laura. She
Hmm.
says, are there healthy, good mood foods? I think it's like comfort foods. Do you have any
Okay.
recommendations for like healthy comfort foods that, give you that like feel good feeling and rewarding feeling, but aren't necessarily packing on the calories too much?
Yeah, I mean, well, one of the things to keep in mind is that when it comes to health and what's going to be healthy for you, the idea of like eating comfort foods is a pretty benign self-soothing behavior, right? I think that like there's nothing wrong with eating like mac and cheese because you want to have a delicious comfort food,
Hmm.
especially, January, February, winter blahs. Making sure you're eating enough is going to be the most important thing in terms of balancing your mood with food. Um, And then if you are trying to eat healthier, right? All foods can fit in a healthy diet. It's not that it has to be extreme in any way. Um, but the what's based in research, one of the only food behaviors that's been consistently shown to increase mood is eating more fruits and vegetables. And
Hmm.
so find things that you like and that you enjoy and maybe even feel like a treat that
Hmm.
don't feel like it's, you know, all unhealthy all the time.
Hmm.
And that's okay too, right? It's again, it's staying centered in that place of self-compassion.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's all balance, right?
Yeah, I think that your point about making sure you're eating enough too, because we're like overworking and then we're forgetting to eat, especially if, you don't have kids who are kind of like reminding you that it's mealtime, right? Like, so you kind of just work through meals or, whatever, and then you end up, and then perhaps you end up having an imbalance where you're eating too much at the end of the day to kind of make up for it because you're like empty. So, yeah, I
Mhm.
think it's really like I think it's like balance, but yeah, I think maybe the fruits and vegetables give you anything can be a comfort food, but it's like the fruits and vegetables actually have like a sustainable mood balancing aspect to them, which is really
Yeah,
good to hear.
absolutely. Absolutely, and in terms of, like, comfort foods, like soups and stews all the way, like,
Mm,
that's we had stew last night with garlic bread, and it was like,
mm,
yeah, this is what we need right now.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Totally. Great. Yeah. So, also, do you have any recommendations for which I could really use recommendations for reminders to drink water? Because I know, we do not, like people generally do not drink enough water during the day. And I think it's just,
Mhm.
we just forget. I think it's just we forget. Do you have any recommendations for that when people ask you?
Yeah, so it depends on what you like. One of the things that I know a lot of people really resonate with are making a ritual around making yourself like a cup of herbal tea, like a non-caffeinated tea, something that's really nice and feels like a treat. That can be a really nice way to break up your work sessions as well. Like I know we're going to talk a little bit about productivity, but the idea of kind of breaking up work every hour or so, getting up and making a cup of herbal tea can be more enjoyable than just plain water if you don't love plain water. Um, Having it there, right? Like I've got my big bottle of water that just sits next to me on my desk all the time. But if you don't enjoy that, you can get a soda stream and make sparkling water and pop some frozen berries in the top or
Mm,
some cucumbers. Like there's a lot of different options that you can play around with to have just drinking more water feel a little bit more of a treat. And
mm,
I think that's self-care includes that too. Like it's not just like it is looking after the basics, but it's also like treat yourself.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Great point. Yeah, definitely. Um, And also remember to comment or ask a question for a chance to win a box of Kind bars from Chocolate Inn Lanco. So let's move into more physical care in terms of exercise. And you just touched
Yeah.
on this a little bit, making sure we're breaking up the day with some activity and movement. How can we do that? And I think another part of that is if you have kids, dogs, get them kind of involved in that activity. But what would you recommend?
Yeah, I mean, exercise is my jam. Like that's that's my background obviously as a personal trainer before moving into like well-being and coaching. And so I think a really big thing is being more generous with our definitions of exercise and physical activity. So physical
Mm-hmm.
activity is anything where you're not sitting down or lying down. So physical activity can be just getting up, making yourself a cup of tea, and just providing yourselves with a little bit more invitations to move. So one of the things that I like to do is have music on in the house. Like if I'm not on a call or, my daughter's napping, have music on and it just invites you to move a little bit more. So, could be waiting for the kettle to boil and whatever, or if you're cleaning up the house, there's some got your jams going. I had the Spice Girls on last week.
Nice.
That just invites you to move. And you, you mentioned kids or dogs. Like I think we all sort of notice that when we even just the trip around the block or to go and check the mailbox, it it shifts your mood. You notice a change to your energy, or if you've been struggling with an idea for work or getting creative, all of those things, right? Like just moving can shift your energy and help you get closer to some solutions and some creativity. So just being a little bit more generous with that and centering your exercise relationship on self-care. Like it can be a way to manage your stress, it could be a way to feel good in your body, that it doesn't have to be this like all or nothing. You have to do an hour and you have to be sweaty and you have to be like sucking wind and need to shower after, right? Like we can pare that down a little bit. It doesn't have to be, just all or nothing.
We actually have a question from Vin Driscoll, who is the director of our website at ASI, and he says, when your job is to
Awesome.
be online and on social media, it's difficult to disconnect from the internet. Do you have any suggestions for us online folk? Perhaps there's a way to remind you to, like, you've been sitting for 3 hours, glued to the screen. Is there a way to remind you to just get up and go do something real quick, just for like 10, 15 minutes?
Yeah, so there's productivity apps that are helpful. There's a whole bunch of different strategies that people can use. So I really like the work for 50 minutes, take about 5-10 minutes break and do work in that way.
Mm,
Um, or, you know, s- set a timer for yourself and set a reminder on your computer that's going to pop up and say like, "Hey, do you want to go for a walk?" kind of thing, especially when we're working from home, that can be hard. And again, I think it comes back to boundaries, right? Like if you say family dinner time is an important time for you, you know, ask yourself, like actually question that belief a little bit. Be like, is it actually going to be a problem for my work if I'm if my phone is off for an hour? And for most people, unless you're waiting on like that one message, that's a belief we can question a little bit. You know what? For this 1 hour, I can shut it off. And if I reply to somebody after 45 minutes instead of 3 minutes, that's going to be fine, right?
mhm,
Or maybe first thing in the morning, right? I think we're so used to alarm clock goes off, grab the phone, scroll through social media, right? As opposed
mhm,
to, give yourself 5 minutes. So choosing strategies that are going to work for you. Not everybody likes setting reminders to move, but just kind of take that moment to reflect for yourself and just be a little bit more purposeful about it, a little bit more mindful about it, and come up with the strategies that you come up with are going to be better than what I tell you to do. The idea that is like, oh yeah, I could do that. And just start little by little, like pick something that's going to feel easy.
mhm.
If it's I'm going to switch off my phone for 20 minutes while I have dinner, that might be a good place to start.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, baby steps. That's a great
Yeah,
idea. Yeah. Also, I think a lot of people, know they've been dealing with it for a year, but maybe it's just really like getting to them and they need to a little reset is like the distractions during the day, especially if you have, work's very demanding and then you have kids kind of pulling at you or dogs barking and, you have a spouse or a partner who's, doing their own thing on the other side of the desk or the other room. And there's just a lot going on. Like, how do you manage distractions that kind of keeps you like calm through them, but what
yeah.
are some of your piece of advice for that?
I would say start with the frame of reference that we are being asked to be smooth all the time,
Mhm,
um, is probably not going to be realistic. And knowing that, I think allows us to move from a place of self-compassion a little bit more. We can think a little bit that we're resting parts of ourself when we're in different roles. So it's like I'm resting my mom self right now because I'm here talking to you. And then when I'm with my daughter, I can choose to be present with her and like switch off the work part of my brain. But also, we need real actual rest too. And that might happen in smaller moments than would be ideal, right? I think it's um, knowing that balance right now is not feasible for most people, I think can help us embrace that mess a little bit more.
Mhm, mhm, great. Yeah, I think giving your like you we said before, giving yourself that space and the compassion that it's not gonna be perfect right now. There's no way it could
Yeah.
be. Right, totally.
Yeah, it's
Um,
not. And again, like what we were talking about before, like that self-care is crucial, like and using small moments to like
mm,
refill our own cup, like
mm,
right,
mhm,
everybody breathe with me right now. Like take a couple of deep breaths, when you switch from one thing to the other, take a moment to just kind of like recenter, you know, mindfulness in whatever way you practice it. Like you may or may not be a meditator, but we can choose to like be present in small moments, I think can go a really long way. Um, and those transition moments too, like if you're transitioning from work to parenting, whatever, like if you have a few minutes, make yourself another glass of water or a cup of tea, or like even when you come out of the bathroom, like go to the bathroom and before you leave and head back into the fray, be like, you know what, I have time to take 3 breaths for
mhm,
myself and just let that stress that builds up within us just kind of melt a little bit.
mhm, mhm. Great. We actually do have a question from Selena. Um, she says, "Hi Martha, I was so focused on attending dance events in the last years that I realized halfway through the pandemic that it wasn't a habit to brainstorm things to look forward to that I could do." So kind of, I think it's that common challenge we have now of like before we didn't always like think we had to worry about what was coming next, and now it's like we actually do have to like try to focus on things to look forward to when maybe we just kind of did
Hmm.
those things. So she says she's looking for creative ways to look forward to things on her own or with like, someone. So lists, pictures, jar of ideas maybe that she could pick from. Like, what do you think about, possibly like looking forward to things, but realizing that nothing's guaranteed right now?
Yeah. So I think that's a really great question, Selena. Thanks for asking that. I think it's hard for a lot of us to be creative right now. If you think of like creativity, a lot of that is like the right side of your brain, and a lot of stress and problem solving is the left side of your brain. And so when we're stressed, it's hard to use that creative side of our brains. And it is challenging right now to think about the future because we've just had this big thing where like the future that we had been thinking of kind of got like that slate got wiped clean. So it makes sense that there is a bit of a struggle there. I think I would turn to the idea of savoring. So savoring is like being present and mindful and enjoying things. And savoring can be something that we do in the present, in the past, and in the future. So savoring in the present could be like sitting with your cup of coffee and just like taking that moment to like breathe and enjoy it and feel gratitude, or whatever you feel, and just like be in that moment of those positive feelings. Savoring looking backward is like reminiscing. So that's like looking through photo albums of like trips that you went on, or if you have
Mm,
kids, looking at pictures of your kids when they were small, or looking at pictures of you with your family when you were small, like reminiscing about that. Or Selena mentioned dancing, like looking back at old dance activities and just feeling those fond feelings. And then we can take that savoring looking forward in terms of really a really nice opportunity to reflect on what our values are and what we actually want to create in our lives going forward.
mm,
So I think that that's one of the things that this pandemic has brought up for so many people, with so many of the outside things like turned off, right? We're like in our sweatpants all the time. We don't see anybody. We don't do anything anymore. All of the outside world has kind of closed for a while, that a lot of us are dealing with some of the inside things, some of the deeper things. And there's a little bit more of an existential nature to like, well, who am I and where do I fit in the world? And that reflection of values. And so I think we're really presented with a unique opportunity to reflect on what matters to me in my life and what do I value in my life and what do I want to see more of. And, you know, dance events may or may not be back, anytime soon. But if we think of, well, what did that dance event give us? An opportunity to be creative, an opportunity to connect to other people, an opportunity to work on a skill set, or whatever it is to you. Um, it can be a way to really clarify what those values are and kind of create some intentions, not for specific things that we're going to do, but for ways that we want to be.
Mhm. Mhm. Great. Well said. Thank you.
Thanks.
Great. Selena, I hope that was helpful. And finally, last question I had for you was it's kind of a big one when we're talking about, self-talk, the compassion we have for ourselves. I think sometimes we're our own worst enemies and we often have more compassion for others than we do for ourselves, right? And so many of these things, they really rely on us to be kind to ourselves, to allow us to make healthy choices for ourselves, to realize that we deserve to feel good, that we deserve good self care. But I think, again, with everything going on, with all the stress, it really gets us. Sometimes we get caught in these, vicious cycles of just like negative self talk that I think undermines
Mhm.
a lot of the good work we're trying to do for ourselves and our families. So, what's the importance of self talk as part of self care? And what are some tips that you would offer for people to have better self talk and better conversations with themselves?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's, like you said, it is a big question. And I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that it's going to be a process. Starting to unravel some of those beliefs really um, can be not so straightforward. So if it's something that an individual really struggles with, it might be an area to have a bit more therapeutic support and kind of work through with a therapist is always, a worthwhile thing to do if that's something that you have access to. But I think for, general self-talk, it's like start to be more aware of it, start to notice it and think that we can have a little bit of space between the thought and the action. Right. So we tend in cognitive behavior model, we think of it as like it's called the ABC model, so that there's an activating event, so something happened and then we think that it caused a consequence, but in between that there's a belief, and if we can look at what the belief is and question it a little bit, then sometimes that can help shift that. So if, say, it's somebody didn't respond to my text was the event, and my real friend, right? So we can look at, well, what's the belief there? And they're like, is the belief that if somebody doesn't respond to me in 5 minutes, that means they don't like me anymore? And it's like, no, there's possibly other definitions. And so knowing that there are at least other explanations is really helpful to just have a little bit of space. The other thing is when we have thoughts that feel like, the mean thoughts or like difficult like body image thoughts. I know that's a thing that's really going on with a lot of people, or people being hard on themselves for their like eating or exercising habits or whatever they are. We can think of how would we talk to a friend who told us that we were that they were feeling that way. So if your friend was like, "Oh, I shouldn't go anywhere because I've, you know, put on some weight since whatever," be like, you would approach them with compassion. You wouldn't be like, "Oh, you're horrible," right? We would never speak to a friend the way that we speak to ourselves sometimes. Can also be really helpful to kind of like name it to tame it, like name that voice. And I've talked to a lot of people about the idea of like it's like the inner mean girl, right? And so if we think of like, okay, what's that inner mean girl voice? And then you can even, if you have the space to do it, start to think, well, what's going on with the inner mean girl, right? Like, what's she feeling? And what happens for so many people is like under that meanness, there's hurt,
Mm.
right? And so, and then there's like this sensitivity. So if we can like hold our like inner mean girl, be like, I'm sorry you feel hurt right now, right? We tend to over focus on the things like body image or be really hard on ourselves when there's other stuff going on, right? And we say that that's the problem, but it's really that there's other problems that we're hustling for our worthiness. We're totally over, you know, loaded with stress. We're burnt out, whatever. And so we're like, well, let me take that out on the area that I have control. And then we're like, let's just drill that one, right? So it's sometimes the negative self-talk can be more of a symptom of like a global pandemic
Hmm.
than it is the problem itself.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Great. Well said. Yeah. And I
Long
think,
answer, but I hope it was helpful.
no, I think it's perfect. And I think too, we should remind people, like, if you, like you had said, if you have access, see a therapist. I mean, if it's really like, sometimes you have to
Absolutely.
say, I can't do this on my own. I have to see a
Absolutely.
therapist. And if something is like, and I want to make sure everybody listening knows too, like, if something is serious, if it's you or a family member or a friend, they need to see you or they need to see a health professional, right? Like there's a certain point,
Absolutely.
yeah, where it's breaching, a level of depression or anxiety that needs professional intervention. That's a decision that's important to make too. Um,
Absolutely. And I would add too that if you have access, say through like work benefits or whatever, and or you can afford to go to therapy,
mm,
you don't have to wait until it's so bad that you feel like you can't handle.
right.
It can be something that's supportive regardless of like you don't have to wait until it's like a full-blown crisis to have a bit more support. And I think that like when it comes to our mental health, we can be more proactive than that. We don't have to like wait until we're like completely floundering and have no other options to look for some support. And so therapy is great for that. Or if you're, subclinical with anything, right? Coaching is great for that. Or talking to our friends, even peer support is really important about our difficult emotions. I think that a lot of us struggle with talking about our hard feelings. And so knowing, the two or three friends that you have that you can be really real with is, can be really helpful.
Great. Yeah, really well said. I think in this time of isolation, we're like forgetting to talk to our friends, and it's like
Right?
it was hard enough before, and now with the separation, it makes it even harder. But we do have
Yeah.
one last question that we had talked about
Hmm.
sleep early on. I didn't want to
Yeah.
let it go without addressing it, but it's from Carrie Barreca, and she says, "Hi Martha, any tips to improve sleep? I like to avoid pills if possible. I seem to wake up after only 3 to 4 hours and can't always go back to sleep. I eat well, exercise. I've been doing breathing exercises, but I still wake up too early." Now, we had talked a little bit about this. Could you just reiterate some of your
Mhm.
like basic sleep tips? And like you said, it's a slow process, right? Little by little, trying to make these improvements.
Yeah, little by little. Thanks for the question, Carrie. So I would start looking at the sleep hygiene was what it's called, which is like, dark in the bedroom, having a good like wind down routine, whether it's, after dinner, having no screens, cup of herbal tea to relax, maybe a bath, creating a good bedtime routine. Sometimes there's other underlying issues. So if it is something that has been a prolonged issue, it's worth talking to your GP and potentially doing a sleep study like that. That's an option as well. Um, if it's the not falling asleep and it's the waking up, then I've seen and heard a few people say that meditation can be really helpful. I have the Muse headband for meditating, and that measures your brain waves. And they have a sleep specific one
Mm,
to help measure sleep. And then also, what's really cool with it, because it's biofeedback, you can get a graph of what's happening with your brainwaves at night, which is going
whoa.
to kind of let you know what's actually happening with your sleep cycles. So if
Hmm,
you're not able to go in and do a real sleep study, you can get more information that way. It's a little
wow.
bit expensive, but if
Mm,
it's been an ongoing thing, it might be something worth exploring.
hmm.
But yeah, if all of the other things seem like they're in place, then looking into some things like meditation or talking to GP for a sleep study could be worth exploring.
And where do you, just for reference, where can you get the headbands that you mentioned?
You can order them online. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
The
Great.
company's called Muse. It's
Muse. Oh, fantastic. Great.
yeah, it's biofeedback meditation, and they have one that's for sleep.
Oh, wow. Great. Well, thank you. Really appreciate that, Martha. Very helpful. So,
Yeah, no problem.
well, we've covered a lot of information today, Martha. So I really appreciate your time. And for more coronavirus coverage, please head to icicentral.com/news. Thanks for listening.
Thanks again.